This is a meeting of the Sam and Esther Dolgoff Institute. Today's guest is Jon Bekken, who's a Wobbly historian. He's going to be talking to us about the Marine Transport Workers Union of the IWW. So, Jon, take it away.
Then a whole lot of detail, which I know is going to take longer than I would want it to take, and so I'm going to have to cut as I go. The fundamental point is that the Marine Transport Workers it's received more attention in the last decade or so than previously, but it has not received anywhere near the attention it should have received from IWW historians. And I think that's in large part because there is this mythology that many of them are committed to perpetuating of the IWW as a transit organization with no viable industrial strategy that would roll into a place, hold a big strike, disappear. And so Melvin Dubofsky, who wrote what people, for reasons that escape me, continue to believe is the definitive history of the IWW.
That's just so I can get notified.
Talks about how MTW was the, quote, one stable and effective IWW organization outside the Western states. But then he only gives it 4 paragraphs in the entire hundreds of pages of the book. So he recognizes that it was stable and effective, but he's so uninterested in a stable and effective IWW operation that he proceeds then to ignore it. And that's been the case for the vast majority. There's been some work, in particular on the Philadelphia docks and the MTW there. But outside of my work and a chapter in the Wobblies of the world, there's really been almost nothing on the MTW outside of Philadelphia. I did send the slides. I assume that's not working on your end either. It's not the end of the world. So from the 1910s through the 1920s, the MTW, the Marine Transport Workers, exercised real power in their industry. Many shipping lines found themselves obliged to accede to MTW demands, typically delivered by a crew committee as the ship was preparing to sail, because this is a very time-sensitive industry, right? And so you want to strike while the iron is hot. If the ship doesn't sail, the company is in a very difficult position. There were moments when it appeared that the union was going to become the dominant American maritime union, but ultimately it wasn't able to dislodge the International Seamen's Union and the International Longshore Association. However, even in ports where there were only a handful of Wobblies, the MTW still had an impact far beyond its numbers, in part because of its reputation as a militant fighting union, in part because its direct action tactics maximized workers' power, but also because the MTW never accepted the divisions of trade and port that enabled maritime employers to isolate workers' struggles. So first off, I'm going to talk about the Spanish immigrants and the Marine Firemen's Union. Marine firemen on the Atlantic coast were almost entirely immigrants from Spain. Some people talk about them as Spanish-speaking, and this is mostly true, although some spoke Catalan. But it can convey in our modern times a false impression. Most of them were born in Spain, spent some time in the Caribbean in some cases, other cases came straight to the US, and they were an estimated 90% of the people who operated the coal-fired steam engines that powered steamships from the 1890s through the 1920s, when they began displacing them with diesel. They formed their first union, the Union de Fogonados, Cabos y Engrasadores del Atlántico, the Stoker Sailors and Oilers Union in 1892. It collapsed in 1902 after a failed strike, but reorganized without the sailors a few years later. And in 1909, they affiliated with the AFL's International Seamen's Union. The Fogonados were a strategic force. On the one hand, you can't move a steamship without steam, and that steam is generated by the boilers, right? So you could, in theory, sail without people on the decks. It would be kind of dangerous, but you don't need that many people if you're just moving cargo. The ship doesn't go anywhere without the steam. Moreover, on passenger lines, the numbers could be really huge. Sister ship of the Titanic was leaving England when the firemen walked off because the Titanic had sunk. They were a little concerned about the lifeboats. They went to inspect because instead of getting proper lifeboats, management had installed canvas lifeboats that were foldable. So they opened them up, and one of them put his hand straight through the side of the boat, and they decided that this was not a suitable lifeboat. And so more than 100 firemen walked off the ship, and they had to import new firemen to run it. Now, they needed all those firemen because not only are they driving this very large ship, but they're also powering lights and cooking facilities and such throughout the ship, right? A merchant ship might be able to get by with 15 or 20 firemen, but it's still a fairly large, often more than half the component of a ship's crew. Ultimately, they're displaced by oil engines that require far fewer workers. But until that point, they had enormous power. So the Fogonados joined the AFL, the International Seamen's Union, in 1909. They spent the next 3 years trying to build solidarity across crafts in order to mount a coast-wide strike from Boston to Galveston, Texas in 1912. That strike involved the loose federation of several Seamen's, International Longshoremen's, and Knights of Labor who controlled longshoring in Boston. We think of them as long dead by 1912, but they controlled longshoring in Boston until World War I, when the U.S. government forced them off the docks and signed a sweetheart deal with the ILA, which they thought was more cooperative. So after months of preparation, it began on June 29th of 1912 with 30,000 workers, according to mainstream press, striking in Boston, Galveston, Hoboken, New Orleans, and New York. The ISU-affiliated cooks and stewards crossed the picket lines from the start because they said the firemen's demands were unreasonable. The engineers, who were another AFL union, refused to join from the start. A handful of lines settled in the first week, but seamen's participation was really spotty. It was the longshoremen and the firemen basically who carried the strike, but the longshoremen were in separate unions in each port. And as employers met their terms, they settled and returned to work. So after the ILA settled the remaining ports on July 29th, a month into the strike, for a substantial pay raise, almost 30%, the ISU seamen on strike all returned to work, abandoned the strike, which left the firemen with no alternative to surrender. This left the firemen really annoyed, because what's the point of being in a union if you're going to cross each other's picket lines and undermine each other's strikes? So they withdrew from the International Seamen's Union and they joined the IWW. And in 1913, that's a really strategic moment when they did this, to be joining the IWW, because it's the same year that the Philadelphia longshoremen joined the IWW while they're on strike. So we now have a solid majority of the firemen who work the Atlantic coast ships, and we have one port. It's not the major port on the Atlantic coast, but it's a major port that is also a center of IWW support. The Fogonados quickly reached out to other seafaring workers, challenging ISU control on the entire Atlantic coast, but also establishing beachheads in the Great Lakes, the Gulf Coast, and the Pacific ports. This was partly a result of their strategic position below deck. It was partly the seafarers' virulent racism. The union had exclusionary policies. It was founded initially in resistance to allowing Chinese workers to work on the Pacific coast. It then expanded nationally, but while officially it allowed Blacks to become members, in actual practice it didn't. They were barred from membership, and a large number of deckhands and other workers were Black, so that undermined their ability to control the above deck crews. Why Spaniards in the below deck? The ISU considered this not white men's work, and they were a union for white men. And so they couldn't organize. They organized the Spaniards because they would do the work, but then when the Spaniards left, they couldn't find people who were willing, because this was dirty work. You're working with coal under, in the decks, under the decks for hours. They also had an outmoded craft organization, which even in a ship that was 100% ISU would have 6 different constituent unions representing the different crafts. So the cooks would be in one union, the fogoneros in another, the coal shovelers in another, the deckhand in another, the navigation and piloting crews in another union. Just this welter of separate unions with separate contracts that did not cooperate with each other. They were also aided by the fact that after the 1912 strike, the ship owners took advantage of the defeat to slash wages, and many Atlantic officials quit when the International refused to allow them to fight these pay cuts. And so they pretty much had a paper organization that represented pilots, the skilled above deck crafts, but almost, and the cooks, but no one else. It was so weakened that in 1913, the president of the ISU reported to their executive board that he was afraid that the Sailors Union of the Pacific, which then accounted for half of its members, would leave the ISU and reaffiliate to the IWW. There's no evidence that they ever actually considered this, but had it happened, the ISU would have ceased to exist. So by 1917, the MTW was strong enough that seamen working out of Boston forced all ships that sailed out of that port to follow a menu that the union adopted to ensure that workers received decent food. I gave a talk in Boston some years ago about this, and people said they confined themselves to talking about the menu. But when you're on a ship sailing from Boston to Buenos Aires, the food on board really matters, because you can't hop off the ship and get your own food, right? You're stuck. So, and they noted when they put this bill up, this menu up, that if it wasn't honored, they would lower the steam pressure proportionate to the extent to which the menu fell short. They ran the steam engines. They had that means, right? So it's a powerful union in the mid-1910s. During the war, it's subjected to intense surveillance and harassment. My slideshow shows some Bureau of Intelligence and Naval Intelligence reports. But the surveillance is complicated by the fact that the Bureau of Investigation appears to have had only a single Spanish-speaking agent on the entire Atlantic seaboard. So he would travel from hall to hall trying to find out what was going on. And then English-speaking agents would go and just try and collect papers and such around, pretending that they wouldn't speak so that nobody would know that they were police. And then they would send the documents they gathered off to their translators so that they could try to figure out what it was that was going on. But this does complicate their surveillance operation. They did collect newspapers, not just published by the IWW, but from throughout Latin America. Many members were arrested. Union organizers were deported. In 1918, the MTW's weekly newspaper, Cultura Obrera, was barred from the mails, but it continued clandestine publication. So FBI Special Agent H.P. Shaughnessy, on August 8th, went to the post office, seized all the mail coming into the Boston IWW Hall, and it included copies of the June 22nd, 29th, and July 20th issue of Cultura Obrera. And he wrote an indignant letter to the post office saying this paper was banned from the mails 3 months ago. Then in August 23rd, he sees 5 copies of the August 10th issue, and he wrote another indignant letter about how something had to be done to stop this. We're not quite sure when it stopped publishing. That's the last copy he found. Does that mean that there weren't more copies published in 1918? Maybe. Or maybe they found more secure methods of shipping papers around. So one of the questions here, the IWW remains a presence on these ships throughout World War I because they need the fogoneros. They're the only large body of people able to operate steam-powered ships. The U.S. is shipping war material to Europe. They need steamships for that. They're getting ready for, naval operations. They have massive need for steam power, and it's not the time to fire 90% of the working firemen in, the Marine ships. So they're troubled by it. They're monitoring, they're threatening, they're harassing. They're trying to infiltrate people onto ships to keep an eye on what's going on, but there's not a lot they can do to completely break the union. Where to organize? So the strategy that the federal government was focusing on was shutting down union halls along the Atlantic coast. And this was the way that the Seafarers Union was organized. The AFL used their union halls as a place where members would come in, pay their dues, but also get dispatched to the next job. They had agreements with the ship owners, where the ship owners would call them when they needed crews, and then the union would send out the crews. And as long as you've got good relations with the employers, this enables you to maintain dominance among the working seamen, yes? Because you can't work without them sending you. The IWW did have union halls, and they would dispatch workers out of them when they were strong enough that employers would call saying, we need seamen, can you furnish them? But their main strategy was instead to build job branches on the ships. So when a ship was ready to sail, if they had enough seamen, they would go and deliver demands before it shipped, such as proper menus, getting enough food on board. If they weren't strong enough, they would agitate among the crew once it took off, because you're on the ship 24 hours a day, you're working 12-hour shifts, sometimes a little less, but typically 12-hour shifts. That leaves you 3 or 4 hours a day to talk to your fellow workers about what's going on and how this menu stinks. And at the next port, maybe we should demand they put on better food, and so the union would build strength as the ship went from port to port. There's one crew that the MTWU lined up en route from New York to the Panama Canal. It had 3 members when the ship left New York. It had 22 when it reached the Panama Canal. And then they won better food, extermination of the bed bugs that infested their sleeping quarters and other conditions. They continued organizing, and when the ship reached Sydney, the captain fired 4 of the most active MTW members. The remaining crewmen refused to sail without them, all of them. They had enough support that nobody who was working the ship, they weren't all members, but nobody who was working the ship was willing to continue on the ship if they didn't bring back the union members. And so he had 16 members arrested on mutiny warrants. They were sentenced to a week in jail in a kangaroo court proceeding, and they replaced the entire crew with new people. And the IWW did not have a strong presence. It had been outlawed in Australia by that point. They were able to replace the crew while the workers were in jail. So we do have a number of these kinds of examples, but I'm already way behind where I intended to be in my notes, so I'm going to move forward. There were several examples of seamen winning, in one case, an 8-hour day on the SS Steel Navigator. And they also got a pay hike to go along with their 8-hour day. They showed up the day the ship was ready to sail, and they said, we're not sailing unless you change the hours. Now, it was a 7-day week, of course, because you can't have weekend crews. But so San Pedro was then a strong union town. Both IWW had a lot of longshoremen, but it also had a very strong presence among seamen there. And so he couldn't find scabs and he was forced to capitulate. Similarly, among longshoremen in Hoboken, New Jersey, MTW member was working cargo there. MTW had dozens of members, but the ILA controlled the port. The ILA gangsters tried to stop him from working, and the entire crew, almost all of whom were ILA members, walked off the job. They weren't willing to have IWW members kicked off the job. They knew they were good union people. And that then did, as long as you had that level of support, as a minority union, you could continue to function and agitating and, for better conditions. 18 months after that, mid-1920s, the Marine Worker, the MTW's English language paper, announced that MTW members were receiving higher wages than were Seamen's Union, the AFL union members on the East Coast, because they kept striking against the Seamen's Union scale. And they had enough support. The Seafarers Union president testified to Congress that a majority of seafarers on the Atlantic coast were IWW members. And the IWW responded to the Marine Worker that wasn't true. The conditions would be a whole lot better if it was true. But they certainly had as many members as the seafarers did, and much more support than the seafarers did, because they got their members through fighting for them, not through collaborating with the bosses to get them jobs on the ships. During the war, the ISU did gain the upper hand in members because the government ran shipping board hiring through ISU halls. But by 1922, internal ISU reports, I went through their papers in Chicago, acknowledged that the MTW once again controlled many Atlantic and Gulf Coast ports. In October 1922, an ISU organizer gloated that the shipping board had decided to wipe Wobblies out of longshoring, but President Andrew Furusef reported that the IAWW had regained complete control of the Boston waterfront. In 1923, very few ships left Boston without a majority of the crew carrying IWW cards. MTW was once again issuing menus with the IWW seal affix, which they posted on the ship, showing what food would be served on what days throughout the entire trip. And ship owners who didn't follow the menu didn't have steam. And so, at that point, the MTW had 3,000 members working out of its New York City branch. And in 1923, 1,995 members of ISU and other AFL-affiliated unions traded their paid-up union membership cards in the AFL for MTW cards. You got a waiver of initiation fees if you turned in your AFL card. So this is a significant withdrawal of people from the AFL to the IWW. The ISU tried to combat this by kicking Wobblies off the ships. In Boston, the ISU's Boston branch, which was so weak that it could only hold one meeting a year. They didn't have enough members to actually staff their meetings very often. They announced that they were going to refuse to sail with IWW firemen, but they also called on the ISU to force the firemen off the ships, noting, quote, "The shortage of Anglo-Saxon at the present time is a severe handicap. If we had 50 firemen available, we could break this up in the Eastern and every other line." So the fact that they didn't have any as they considered them, white, because they didn't consider Spanish speakers or Italians or Portuguese to be white, made it impossible for them to actually organize below the decks. And without organizing below the decks, they were not in a position to enforce their demands. The ISU had a national effort where they negotiated with one line to kick the MTW crews off and to bring in Southern black workers instead for $5 less per week. This proved controversial in the ISU, and it's not clear whether this was because of the racism of ISU members, because, if you have black workers on ship, then you've got to bunk with the black workers and eat with the black workers, right? There's no possibility of running a Jim Crow system. You can Jim Crow the jobs, but you can't Jim Crow the food arrangements. or whether it was because it was thought unseemly. They talked about the unseemliness of this in their resolutions, but that it just looked bad to be bringing in lower paid people as union workers to break the IWW. But I'm not convinced that racism didn't play a role. My second point, and I've got to move faster. The Wobbly papers carry detailed reports on the struggles and conditions of maritime workers around the world. In September 1925, MTW called a strike in solidarity with a strike by British seamen refusing to handle ships from England. And dozens of ships were tied up in Baltimore, Mobile, Alabama, New York, and Philadelphia. And you don't think of Mobile, Alabama as a stronghold of IWW support, but they had a union hall in Mobile into the 1950s. The MTW did. The Baltimore MTW forwarded the names of scabs who shipped out on British-originated ships to MTW affiliates in Latin America so that the scabs could be greeted appropriately when they arrived in Latin American ports. Some shipping lines settled with the MTW, but ISU, the lines that settled paid $15 more a month under their agreement than the shipping board ISU scale. But the MTW was not strong enough to shut down shipping. And at the end of the month, they returned to the job with a statement noting that they felt they had offered invaluable aid to the strike and that seamen wouldn't forget the display of solidarity. But they called on workers to return to the ships and prepare for the next strike. And of course, they're carrying the union with them from port to port. Many of the firemen do speak the language throughout Latin America, and so they are able to talk to dock workers in Latin America, to talk to other workers, and there's a lot of evidence of exchange of union publications. The IWW did send printing presses to Latin American unions that were trying to set up IWW branches to print local papers and such. It was the union's only effectively international hall. And I have a slide that shows where they had halls, but in Bremerhaven, Hamburg, and Stettin, Germany, Tampico, Mexico, Stockholm, Sweden, Adelaide and Sydney, Australia, Vancouver and Port Arthur, Canada, Iquique and Valparaiso in Chile for many years. The Chilean halls for more than 20. When Puerto Rican dock workers tired of working for 25 cents an hour under their ILA contract and saw that the MTW was the only union that refused to work ships headed their way during the strike, they formed an MTW branch in Puerto Tierra. In Germany, the Maritime Arbeiter was published from 1925 to 1930. MTW members in Stettin joined a general strike of German maritime workers in 1924. Obviously, conditions in 1930 made it difficult to continue running a syndicalist union, and they did not recover from the Nazi repression. The Chilean section had 9,000 members in 7 maritime cities before it was suppressed by a military dictatorship in the late 1920s. And at one point, they had union halls in 12 Chilean ports. In 1927, when they were outlawed, several Chilean Wobblies went to Guayaquil, Ecuador, where they had established a MTW branch in the mid-1920s. And then they reorganized in 1936 after the military dictatorship was toppled, publishing La Voz de Industrialismo on a press donated by U.S. Wobblies, but they didn't survive past the 1940s. There was also an active role in Mexico. I think that's somewhat better known. And the IWW maintained a strong presence in the American maritime industry through the 1940s, albeit often a minority one. Both the National Maritime Union in the CIO and the Sea Scabbers in the AFAVL worked to keep IWW supporters off ship. In 1937, when the NMU was unable to provide enough seamen in New York to staff a ship that was leaving, and so they called the IWW hall for seamen to enable them to have a full crew, the NMU refused to allow them to sail unless they quit the IWW. And so the ship had to sail shorthanded because the NMU controlled that ship. Dock workers, I've already mentioned the Philadelphia docks where MTW held job control from 1913 until 1921, and then a very active presence and several strikes from 1922 until the emergency program strike in 1924. They continued to mount strikes into the 1930s, but no longer had a majority of the workforce. They had to organize around specific issues, such as refusing to load a ship that was carrying munitions to Franco's forces in Spain, which did shut down that ship. And they took off the seamen. And so the ISU had to send seamen down from New York in order to sail the ship to arm the fascists. There was a 1920 strike that again shut down the entire waterfront, and with 7,000 strikers, Union firemen, obviously they were Wobblies because there weren't any other firemen working the Atlantic Coast ship, refused to provide steams. That mattered because the hoists that were used to haul stuff off, heavy cart loads off the ships and move them over those cranes, they were powered not from the port. They were powered by the steam engines on those ships. So when the firemen refused to provide steam power, then you had to carry everything off by hand, which required many more scabs and took much longer. And some things had to be disassembled before they could be carried off. You know, if you had a pallet of stuff, you can't have people carrying that down the gangplank, right? Union cooks also refused to feed the scabs. The coal hoisters refused to refuel the ships during that strike. Two British crews informed their captains that they wouldn't sail if scabs loaded any cargo onto the ship. In 1936, I mentioned that strike, but then after the strike against the fascist cargo, there was a West Coast strike where the Pacific Coast unions had broken from the AFL, and they led a longshore and seaman strike that began in November. The MTW supported it vigorously in Philadelphia and also in Houston and Galveston. Scores of Wobblies were arrested in Philadelphia, armed coons kidnapped picketers. In Houston, an international sea scabbers official shot and killed Wobbly John Kane while he was picketing. 600 workers attended his funeral. The strike was ultimately defeated. The Pacific Coast Union seceded from the AFL, so the Sailors Union became independent. The International Longshore Workers broke off. And for a while, Sailors Union of the Pacific members worked out of NTW halls when they were on the Atlantic coast, rather than shape up on the docks or through the detested National Maritime Union, which had scabbed on their strike. In 1937, an NMU organizer estimated in an internal union report that there were 10,000 MTW seamen. He said the NMU and ISU each had 25,000 on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. So it was still a significant number of members. Were his estimates true? It's not entirely clear to me from the records that he wasn't overestimating everybody's union membership, but nonetheless, a significant force. By the end of the decade, though, the MTW was surrounded by union contracts that cemented business unionism in place and hiring through the union hiring halls. The longshoremen lasted longer in the Atlantic coast and retained a union hall in Galveston into the 1960s. Shoremen did. And that hall mattered less for job control. They didn't have job control, but they had a number of members working in the ports. And the ILA still had segregated union locals in those ports. And the black local, whenever the ILA would threaten not to support them, they would say, we're going to join the IWW if you don't go along. And that was a credible enough threat that they were able to win several strikes to get white workers to honor their picket lines and such forth, because the IWW was a serious organization. It had a union hall that seated 250 people in Galveston. I'm not saying they filled that hall on a regular basis, other than for special programs or such. The Sailors Union of the Pacific at one point considered putting their headquarters in the IWW hall because it was one of the few union halls available that would have allowed them in. So I'm going to skip ahead because I really have been going on far too long. I'm going to skip over the Portland strike and the 1924 San Pedro strike, which had many Wobblies tarred and feathered. And they had to ship scabs down from San Francisco to break that strike. Shipping was paralyzed on the West Coast by the strikes in San Pedro and San Francisco until the ISU's president, Andrew Shurasef, sent scabs down to break that strike. And MTW did return to work to break the scabs, but the availability of AFL scabs along the entire port enabled the employers to fire 2,300 IWW dock workers in San Pedro in 1924, and bits and pieces, but and the IWW was never able to reinstate its membership on that port. So the legacy of the MTW, I'm going to wrap it up, lies in part in that tradition of solidarity and resistance, which had spread to workers outside of the ranks of the IWW who knew that they could count on the IWW if they were waging their own strikes and did not like working alongside scabs or crossing picket lines. It also demonstrates the possibility of maintaining a meaningful union presence, one capable of winning significant victories over several decades, even where they don't have majority of the workforce or formal union recognition. It also speaks to the possibilities of forging a culture of resistance that transcended national borders. Peter Deschaz on Robert Halstead many years ago, who wrote it's unpublished, but the only history of the IWW in Chile as a master's thesis, noted that to ignore IWW internationalism is to fail to appreciate the IWW's perception of itself. It was the logical conclusion of IWW class analysis. And so there was no reason for the working class to respect national boundaries drawn by its masters. Similarly, Anton Rosenthal, in A History of the IWW Press in Latin America, notes the universal appeal of IWW rhetoric and strategy. Itinerant organizers, he says, crossed oceans and borders, advocating direct action tactics and a vision of a new emancipatory labor movement. The primary way that the IWW connected with workers was to talk about exploitation and authority in its newspapers. The IWW Press served as a space of resistance to the pervasive workplace control exercised by abusive employers and to the widespread repression unleashed by governments on their national labor movements. So that's really my point. Internationalism, direct action, this sustained the IWW as a force in international maritime, mostly in North and South America, but also with active presences in Australia for a time, in Europe for a much longer time. You had the remnants of an IWW Stockholm branch into the 1970s, although it worked closely with the SAC and was mostly by that point retired. And you even had correspondence and solidarity strikes in China during the 1920s with IWW strikes on the West Coast. So there was a real international presence and a real commitment to international solidarity. I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. We'll open the floor to questions now. Or comments. I'll just start off. You did mention the Sailors Union of the Pacific. My understanding was that the Sailors of the Union Pacific was at least IWW friendly and was kind of a spinoff of the IWW. Could you tell us a little bit more about them?
The Sailors Union predated the IWW on the one hand. So I'm not saying there were certainly times when they were very friendly, but there were also periods, as particularly when the IWW was gaining strength and There were long periods when they were quite hostile. Andrew Furisev in particular was hostile, but he dies in the 1930s, and the the SUP is becoming much more militant through the 1930s. Partly it's the conditions, partly with the formation of the National Maritime Union on the West Coast, on the East Coast, the ISU really has become a paper tiger, and it doesn't have the means to enforce its discipline anymore on the workers. And so that really does cut down their influence. So there are periods in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s where the SUP and the IWW are pretty friendly, and there are periods where the IWW sort of functioned almost as a caucus within the Sailors Union for more militants. The Sailors Union, after the 1940s, IWW is not really a force in the industry anymore, and it becomes much friendlier in its recollections. But they did expel in the early 1920s the editor of their newspaper, who they contended was a Wobbly. He was not, in fact, a Wobbly, but he did advocate that the maritime unions should develop a federation that encompassed the longshoremen and the seamen and had much more practical solidarity with each other.
Thanks. Shelby?
Anatole has been waiting.
Okay.
And Anatole has actually set foot in an MTW hall.
I want. Hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask you something. I read I guess it was from probably just my judgment, early 40s, late 30s. There were elections, and the different unions were presenting their cases. And one of the issues was establishing some kind of medical treatment for the sailors. In other words, some kind of a plan. And all the other unions produced plans, so there's some kind of medical care. And then the Wobbly thing, I found it kind of shocking. He says, we have no medical plan. Almost like he's proud of it. So I asked myself, how are you going to convince workers that they're having elections, and there's one group that says we could get you some medical plan, medical care, and the other says we're not interested in it. We're not going to. Do you get my point?
I do.
And can you speak about some of the tactics of the Wobblies? Maybe they made some mistakes. That's all I'm trying to say.
By the 1930s, the MTW is definitely weaker on the seaboard on the one hand. And I don't think the organization had the capacity to actually offer a medical plan. The AFL unions affiliates were linked up with national unions that had negotiated union plans in some of their contracts with various medical providers. I'm not saying how good those plans were, but there was a tradition, there was a body of union insurance plans that had existed for decades in the AFL craft unions, which simply I don't think was available to the IWW on a practical level. And it's particularly difficult in maritime because in Cleveland, for example, you could try and negotiate, and I don't know if they did, but you had dozens of IWW shops in Cleveland. You could try and negotiate arrangements with a hospital or doctors or something like that because your members live in Cleveland, yes? In maritime, your members are sailing out of New York and Boston and Mobile, Alabama, and they're on ship and then they land in port and they're ill, and who knows where the hell they are when they land in port and they're ill. You need some sort of a plan that's not tied to any locale. And I think that probably did require a much stronger infrastructure than the IWW could possibly have provided at that time. But also there is this ideological question of, is the union a service provider, or does it, fight for the members, demanding the boss?
Is it a combat organization, or is
yes.
it a welfare organization?
Well, I'm not questioning the sincerity of the people involved. It's just that I don't see how in modern times you can compete on the basis of not having things that you offer. In other words, you could offer better meals on the ship. That's fine. But why can't you offer some kind of? But you told me your statement was that it was very hard to organize. I understand that, but they seemed almost proud of the fact that they had no medical plan. The tone of their response was almost contemptuous. Maybe
I
I'm
hadn't
reading
seen
into it.
that.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And I do believe that it was actually, it's one thing for me to believe this, and it's another thing to say that you can continue on this line today, okay? I do believe that it was a mistake to focus on employer-driven medical plans that then does prevent a sort of a base of medical provision across the society. I think social medical care makes much more sense.
So do I.
But in a period when the only way you can get medical coverage is through your union, I understand the logic. And yet I know that some years ago, I was working with a union trying to organize part-time faculty, and we explored the possibility of offering medical coverage. And we met with insurance companies, and the terms that we were being offered were, on the one hand, very expensive, and on the other hand, offered lousy coverage. Because we just didn't have enough members,
it wasn't practical. Yeah.
But I will say in Houston, the IWW did win some NLRB elections in the 1940s. But that's slightly different because those were tugboat workers. And they had an active campaign for 3 years among tugboat workers, held a number of strikes. The tugboat workers are all
bound to a port,
going out to bring the ships in, but they're in Houston, right? And so you can offer locally based services and resources and such in a way that is harder on the ships that are working Boston to Buenos Aires.
Shelby.
Thank you.
Yeah, in regard to medical care, one alternative to union-based medical care was through fraternal organizations. Workmen's Circle had its own medical program, and that was an attraction for people to join the Arbeiterring because they, at a time when there was no social welfare, this was one way of getting it. The question I had, though, was what was the relationship of Harry Bridges to the MTW, if any?
Harry Bridges was, for several months, a member of the IWW when he first started out in the industry. He left the IWW when he settled in San Francisco as a longshoreman. He had been a seaman. And he joined the ILA. And from then on, by the time the ILWU is established in the 1930s, the IWW no longer has an active presence among longshoremen on the West Coast. So my sense was that he was sort of friendly to the IWW in this abstract sense, but he didn't have to confront IWW competing for members on the coast. IWW was a force in the Gulf Coast, but the Gulf Coast was still ILA territory. The ILWU had not succeeded in breaking into it. And so where the IWW is fighting with the AFL, A, he's not in the AFL, and B, he doesn't have members there. And so he can very well afford to be, friendly to that. Yes. His relations with the SUP fluctuated, but were mostly friendly because the SUP was outside of the AFL for much of this time. Some of this time it was with the CIO, some of this time it was independent. It ultimately rejoins the AFL long before, and the ILWU, of course, is kicked out of the CIO, right? And so they're independent for many years. They're back in the AFL now because the AFL is not in a position to be picky about, who they let join. But, so I believe, I haven't studied this, but I was in San Francisco for several days back in the 1990s. And I did meet with Wobblies who were working with the ILWU back then, trying to organize the casuals, and several ILWU officials, not the ILWU as a whole, but several ILWU officials were cooperating with them. So ILWU has Class A workers who are guaranteed an annual income, whether they work or not. They have Class B workers who work pretty steadily, who are enrolled, who get first call on dock jobs. And then they have Class C workers who aren't members of the ILWU, who shape up by the day, might work weeks out of the year. And the IWW was trying to organize the Class C workers to do health and safety trainings, which some ILWU business agents and such help them run, to acquaint them with the safety standards in the industry, and trying to set itself up sort of as an auxiliary that would represent the people excluded from regular work on the docks. And that's a campaign that ran for 3 or 4 years. The problem is, by definition, if there was a road to the ILWU reopening Class B membership, then you could have held people in Class C on the theory that they would, have this prospect of getting regular employment at full union wages and benefits. But the ILWU would go 10, 15 years between bouts of opening up the Class B enrollments. And so why do you then take this work? Either you're desperate and you get out of it as soon as you can because it's not reliable in any way, or you're doing it because you think it's romantic to be a longshoreman. And that romance can only carry you so far, yes?
Mhm.
Some of the people in that campaign did move to Seattle and did get jobs because in Seattle, roles were opened. And so they were able to get work there. But they became bitter opponents to the IWW once they did that.
You have a question?
Yeah.
You're muted, Jeff.
Mark had his hand up, and then Lewis, and then Erica.
Great, thanks. John, that was great. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I did get a chance to look at your slides that have been posted in the chat. I had a couple of questions. First, my ears, of course, pricked up when you mentioned Vancouver. And if you can, maybe later, if you send me any kind of sources that, is there much known about what's happening up here in Canada? And the IW. Now, and I say that in part because when I joined the IWW in 1976, I was working as a bridge tender and was signed into, 510 and the Maritime workers. So, but can you talk a bit more about anything that you found about what's going on up here?
I would have to look in my notes. I have a record of a haul there. I think I have some correspondence, but it didn't make it into my paper. So I do have notes. I can do a search of my notes for references to Vancouver.
That would be
Send
great. Great. Just, I think a couple of quick questions, if that's okay. You started off by saying that we don't know much about Wobblies in community, but what sense do you have of it? It sounded like there's sort of a dual nature to the Wobblies that you're talking about, that some of them, dock workers and others and tugboats, they have a base, but lots of them seem like they don't, that they are in a sense transient workers over the waves, and clearly spreading syndicalism from here to Australia to Stockholm to, could you talk a little bit about that even in terms of numbers or that sense or that interplay?
They are certainly transient in the sense that the job is constantly moving and they're constantly moving from ship to ship. My sense is that there was a fairly stable between the 1890s and the 1920s, a fairly stable body of Spanish-speaking firemen, at least, who I'm not quite sure where they lived. I have lists of over 1,000 members that the Bureau of Investigation tallied when they were breaking into union offices and copying down the membership rolls and such. But I'm not quite certain where to look in census records to try to track them down. If I had PhD students, I would try to get them to explore this. But, and I haven't found records, and I did look through Cultura Obrera. I haven't found records for the seamen of mutual aid associations, which would have made a good deal of sense to have, because that could have been something that sort of linked you port to port, particularly during the blacklists and such. And I know there were mutual aid associations in Florida among cigar workers, and
That was mine.
But I haven't found any. Have I read every issue? No. I have hundreds of issues I've downloaded, and my Spanish is such that I have to read slowly. And so I haven't looked at every issue, but I have looked during strikes and such for references to mutual aid associations, and I didn't find them, which would have been one way to solve that problem. The union halls certainly served as community centers. There's no doubt about that. And, the New York Hall, even after people have retired, you have maritime workers who are hanging out in that New York Hall. Some people certainly did live in the cities around the ports that they sailed out of, but I don't have a good enough, because they're sailing ship by ship, I don't have a good enough record. I have a record of people who paid union dues or subscribed to Cultura Obrera on particular ships on particular dates in particular ports, because Cultura Obrera for 10 years published that, and then they stopped, perhaps because of the blacklist, and they just published totals. But, these are very scattered. And just because you're on a ship in Chile doesn't mean that you live in Chile, right? So that is an excellent question, and I really wanted to know the answer to it, and I haven't come up with a means. I know how to do it in the abstract, but it requires a time commitment that I have not been able to bring myself to make.
Thank you.
Hey, Lewis was next, and then Erica, and then Shelby.
Sure. Thanks, John. So you, as an aside, mentioned the National Maritime Union. And I don't know the relationship with the National Maritime Union and the IWW, but my father had a cousin who was in the National Maritime Union and went to Spain with the brigades. And on his exit interview, he mentions as one of his references, Sam. And this is how I met Anatole, by recognizing Sam's name was Sam Weiner in the exit interview, not Sam Dolgoff, but having some of Sam's books. And I checked in with Anatole to see if so-and-so, so-and-so. So I'm wondering if you know anything about the NMU and how it is that my father's cousin might have been listening to Sam, and at what kind of a hall, that Seamen's Hall, if any, that might have been.
So on the one hand, Anatole spent many days in the IWW Seamen's Hall in New York, and he talks about that in the memoir.
Yeah.
The
You need Sam.
Yeah.
Anatole's memoir, Left of the Left, talks about going with Sam to the MTW.
Oh, okay.
The NMU initially had fairly difficult relations with the IWW. On the one hand, the Communist Party had been members until 1926 of the MTW, even after they had left the rest of the Union, and they made a bid to try to take over the MTW, and it was a fairly bitter split. And then when they formed their own union, they named it the Marine Workers Industrial Union instead of the Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union. So they were trying to piggyback. Matt White, in my slides, which I posted, I have a bibliography on the last slide where I mentioned Wobblies of the World. Matt White has a chapter in there on Wobblies in the International Brigades.
I'd love to read that.
That might be worth looking at.
Troublemakers.
He notes that some people were locked up for their IWW ties, but maybe they were also difficult, objecting to orders and such forth. But he does note that there were a number of IWW members from the MTW in there, and they would have been alongside NMU members. There were definitely dual carters, NMU and MTW, just like there were dual carters, MTW and Sailors Union of the Pacific. When the rank and file committee of the NMU called strikes, the MTW, rank and file committee becomes the NMU. It starts as rank and file committee of the ISU, then it becomes the NMU. When they called strikes, the IWW always honored those strikes and those picket lines. But I mentioned the example of the NMU delegate not letting them on a ship that the NMU had a contract with, even though they had strike clearance cards for having honored the strike. And so I think the NMU did see them, at least in the 30s and 40s, as rivals. By the 50s, 60s, I don't think they're so concerned because, the MTW has become a legacy organization by then. It's not really, even after the mid 40s, it's not really organizing ports anywhere outside of Texas. And it's partly able to do that because Texas is a backwater union-wise.
That's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Erica, do you have a question or a comment? Yeah. Erica.
Eric.
Good.
Yeah. I had something I wanted to share, which is I was the main researcher for the documentary that was made and released in 1980 on the Wobblies, the main, and I got very interested in the MTW, especially the whole Philadelphia waterfront. I was working and living in New York. Philadelphia was close, and I really, the directors were interested in it. I was very interested in it. And so sort of the course of my research is what's interesting. So I started doing research, and of course I wanted to find somebody we could interview naturally, or more people if we could. And the first sort of person that I got in contact with was a guy who was doing his MA thesis about the MTW in Philadelphia. And so, of course, I said, and he had some good information. He collected some stuff. He'd written something. But I said something like, well, who have you interviewed? Who have you talked to? And he said, well, no one. And I said, really? He said, yeah, well, I want to get all, my textual stuff, the newspapers and so on. And I'm thinking, it's 1978, and there are certainly Wobblies around, but, they're getting pretty old. And I'm thinking, are you out of your mind? So I thought, okay, never mind about that. So I started looking around. I took probably about 3 trips to Philadelphia, doing research and looking around. Was not very successful. At one point, I was working with this woman who'd done her PhD thesis on the Knights of Labor, and she was very jealous because she knew that there were at least some Wobblies alive. And nobody, she said, "Okay, I'll help you." And I actually had her leaflet the docks looking for someone that said, and the leaflet said, "Was Grandpa a Wobbly?" So that was very fun to do. Did not work at all. In the end, what happened, we did find somebody. I had been talking to Sue Robeson, Paul Robeson's granddaughter, who was living in Philadelphia. I don't remember how I got, whatever it was. And she said she'd try, didn't find really anything. A couple weeks later, she gives me a call and she says, "Well, I found him." I said, "Oh, that's great." And it just turned out this is somebody who lived around the corner from her, and she somehow found out about it. So he's the guy who's interviewed, this African-American guy who's interviewed in the film. And it was very sweet. When the film premiered, I think it was at the New York Film Festival, this man came with all his family from Philadelphia. And when the lights went up after it had finished, he came and he found me and he thanked me for finding him. It was nice. It was a whole process.
What was his name?
James Fair. His name was James Fair. Yeah. So anyway, just wanted to share that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Erica. Shelby, did you have something you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I was thinking about this whole problem of having ocean loads of data, Cultura Obrera subscribers, union members, so on and so forth. And this is where computer-based research can really help.
No kidding.
Yeah, no, I know someone who did studies of sailors in the Boston area and fishermen. And she was able to, Serena Newman was able to get all of these wide, disparate data sets and come up to some very interesting conclusions. But it's one of the, much as I rail against technologia, this is one area where it's helpful. That's it.
In engineering, we used to call that data mining, which is a valid use of the thing, but maybe having it tell you what your political opinions should be is probably not the best use for it. So we have any more questions? Comments?
Fabulous.
Yes, thank you.
Very good talk. You've done a lot of research.
Thank you so much.
It was very good talk.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.